morning. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you also very much for joining us, and thank you for your ongoing support. If you're enjoying our free webinars and would like to join the effort to keep them going, we've just launched a new platform that makes giving easier than ever before. Please stay tuned at the end of this program to get the details on how you can pledge your support. And always go to our website at lawac.org so you can register for upcoming programs. We have a terrific lineup through the summer and well into the fall. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's program, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, with politics professor Dan Schnur. Dan's three focus areas today are the morning headlines, news from the front page, 100 days until the election, a campaign overview, and life in a partisan bubble, and why are we so polarized? For those of you who are new to the program, we will be taking your questions in about 20 minutes. There's a control panel on the right-hand side of the screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions, and she'll try to do her very best to take as many of your questions as possible. Dan, looking forward to another lively discussion. Thank you so much again. Can't wait. Turning it over to you.
Kim, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. I'm looking forward to this conversation with all of you like I do every week. But what I will say is that before we get to our three topics, both the news of the day and the other topics that Kim mentioned, there's one other note I'd like to reference. As many of you know, today is the opening day of the baseball season. And because of the coronavirus, that's almost 4 months late. But the Dodgers are playing tonight, and my beloved Milwaukee Brewers open tomorrow night against the Chicago Cubs at Wrigley Field. For those of you who are baseball fans, you may have once heard the saying from columnist George Will. He says, quote, "Some say that baseball is only a game." True. And the Grand Canyon is only a hole in Arizona. Not all holes, though, or games are created equal. Okay, enough baseball for now. Let's get on with our political discussion. And the first topic today from the morning headlines, as many of you have suggested to me, is to talk about the federal law enforcement presence in Portland and Chicago and potentially other cities around the country. Now, depending on your point of view, we can talk about this either as the federal invasion of Portland and Chicago, or alternatively, the federal rescue of Portland and Chicago. And once again, that probably has more to do with your partisan leanings than anything else. Well, I will say this. I lived in California for 30 years now. And after 3 decades, I take the East Coast bias of the national news media pretty much for granted. But the protests and the federal response to the protests in Portland, Oregon, are an incredible reminder to me of just how East Coast focused national media tends to be. Imagine if the presence of federal law enforcement agents that's been happening every night on the streets of Portland for more than 2 weeks now. Imagine if it were happening instead in Providence or Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. There would have been screaming headlines and constant cable news coverage from day one, instead of just the occasional news stories that have finally started to appear in the last few days. But out here, on the other edge of the country, this has been a very big deal. There are federal law enforcement officers on the streets of Portland. And while there is precedent for such steps, Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s, George H.W. Bush during the unrest here in Los Angeles in the 1990s, this is very uncommon and it's very controversial. But before I go any further on this, I'd be really interested in hearing what all of you think. And so, Claire, maybe you can put up our first question to give everyone a chance to weigh in with their thoughts on this challenge. So our first question today is as follows. Under what circumstances should federal law enforcement officers be deployed in U.S. cities? Under what circumstances should federal law enforcement officers be deployed in U.S. cities? Number one, at the president's sole discretion. Number two, if the president and Congress together agree that it's necessary. Number three, only at the request of state or local officials, or 4, never, that law enforcement is a local and state responsibility and the federal presence is not appropriate in these types of circumstances regardless. So let's take a look and see what everybody has to say, Claire, on this topic. 5% say at the president's discretion, 14% if the president and Congress agree that it's necessary, 78%, more than 3/4, say only at the request of state and local officials, and 3% say never. Now, what's interesting about these results is, of course, back in the 1950s, when Eisenhower sent troops to Arkansas in the interest of desegregation, that was not at the request of local and state authorities. And when Presidents Kennedy and Johnson took similar measures in the 1960s during similar challenges, those interventions also were not at the request of Southern mayors or governors. But what's been reported over the years is even as publicly confrontational as US presidents were in that era by sending federal troops over the publicly stated resistance of local and state elected officials, it's been reliably reported that in that era, the White House and those local officials were in quiet contact. So even if publicly they were on opposite sides of this question, privately they were working together to make sure that these kind of measures were taken in as undisruptive a way as possible. That's obviously has not been the case in Portland. So there's 2 issues here, 2 issues for us to consider. The first is whether it is legal or constitutional for federal agents to be used in this way. And there is some discussion about what the federal agents can do once they have been deployed to a city, where they can go, how they can engage. But it's generally agreed that it is in fact constitutionally permissible. One of the president's fiercest critics refers to it, the steps he has taken, as lawful but awful. But the second question, of course, is whether even more controversial is the way some of these federal officers have been accused of conducting themselves in Portland, arresting people off the street with no probable cause, engaging in unprovoked violence, not wearing badges, and using unmarked cars. Now, the representatives of the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security have argued publicly and in court that the steps they've taken have been justified. But that, even more than the deployment itself, has led to probably the highest level of anger and vitriol in both directions. Yesterday, a federal judge heard arguments in a lawsuit filed by the Oregon Attorney General, and she's seeking a temporary restraining order blocking any detentions by federal authorities without local or state coordination. And it appears that the Justice Department and Department of Homeland Security are also preparing to send federal law enforcement officers into Chicago and possibly into Albuquerque, New Mexico. Although those deployments appear to be a more cooperative effort with local law enforcement, and even though the mayors of those cities do not think that those deployments are a good idea, it appears that there is conversation and coordination taking place. And we can talk more about the details of that a little bit later, should you decide that that's of interest to you. Now, it is worth noting that violent crime is up in many cities this year, and this has been one of the central points that the president has been making, not in Portland, but many of the other cities he's been talking about. In Chicago, for example, the murder rate has skyrocketed. There have been 385 killings in the city of Chicago this year, which is a 48% increase since the same time last year in 2019. Many Portland business owners were upset that the local police weren't doing more to protect them from the protests, because while the protesters were mainly very peaceful in their demonstrations, there were some agitators who used the protests as cover for engaging in more violent behavior. So there is a case to be made about public safety, but it appears that the president is conflating a violent crime spike on one hand with protests on the other into one single broader challenge. And what gives me so much, makes me so confident in thinking about this in a political context is that not coincidentally, the Politico news platform, Politico reported earlier this week that the Trump campaign has spent $24 million on television ads in swing states around the country. In 3 weeks, they've spent $24 million on TV ads. Roughly $20 million of that $24 million is being used to run ads about police, about public safety, and about law and order issues. And I don't believe that that's a coincidence at all. We've talked in the past about how older voters and white working class women, voters who Trump has been losing support from over the last few months, they've been switching to Biden, and they tend, but generally, historically, these two voter groups often focus their attentions very greatly on issues relating to crime and public safety. And so it appears that Trump believes that this is a way to win them back, both in terms of his campaign advertising strategy and some of the real world actions that we've talked about over the last few minutes. So let's move on to our second topic, the 100-day election 100-day election countdown. So actually Sunday is 100 days until the election. We are currently 104 days out. But Tuesday, the day before yesterday, was the 15-week marker until the presidential election. And if you think about that, that's not a lot of time. And it's even a shorter clock when you realize that in some states, early voting by mail, will begin in approximately 7 weeks, roughly half that time. So the election really is upon us. Now, we could spend the rest of this hour and a couple of more talking about the election more broadly, but I'll give you a few thoughts in terms of overview before we move on to our last topic, and then open it up, as always, for your questions and comments and engagement. So where are we in the race? Before I offer my own thoughts, let's get yours. Claire, can you put up the second question for our group today? So we're going to ask you to predict. What do you predict will be the outcome of the presidential election in November? A narrow Trump victory. And by narrow, we're defining that as between 270 and 300 electoral votes. A Trump win, but a close one. Option number 2, a narrow Biden victory. Also a relatively close margin, more than the 270 votes that are necessary, electoral votes that are necessary, but less than 300, which would be the modern measurement of a landslide election. Will it be a large Trump victory? More than 300 electoral votes, Trump winning by a large margin, by a comfortable margin. And fourth and finally, a large Biden victory, with the former vice president achieving more than 300 electoral votes. So those are our options. What do we think? Let's see the answers that come up. And how about that? 8% say a narrow Trump victory. 1% say a large Trump victory. So less than 10% of our participants think Donald Trump will win re-election this year. 57% of you believe it will be a narrow Biden victory. 34%, a little bit more than a third, a large one. But if you add those up, 91% of the people participating in our survey believe Joe Biden will be reelected and will be elected. And of course, at this point, there's some justification for those beliefs. The Washington Post poll, considered one of the nation's standards, came out last week, showing Biden with a 15-point lead. Now, as we've talked about before, the raw numbers of these polls aren't nearly as important as the trending and as the trajectory. And along those lines, the news looks even better for Biden, because while the Post poll had Biden up by 15 points last week, back in March, Biden was ahead of Trump, but only by a margin of 2. So that 15-point lead is the largest one we've seen in any national polling. Other polls have Biden ahead by between 8 and 12 points. But every national poll shows that Biden has been steadily increasing his lead over the course of the last few months. And the reason for that, according to every single one of these polls, is the American voters diminishing support for the way the president has handled the coronavirus crisis. The bottom line is this: Donald Trump took a gamble this spring when he decided to push for a faster reopening of the country. As we've talked about in previous webinars, incumbent presidents running for re-election tend to be unsuccessful during economic downturns. The president and his advisors are aware of that. And so rather than keeping the country more closed down, they realized that pushing for a more aggressive opening would increase the likelihood of an economic comeback. Now, that was a gamble. And what we've seen over the last few weeks, as caseloads and hospitalizations have risen dramatically around the country, is that the gamble that Donald Trump took this spring didn't pay off. We're now seeing not only a rise in cases and hospitalizations, but we're seeing the impact of the further spread of the virus on the economy. We see roughly 25 million Americans unemployed. The new unemployment filings that are just out this morning for last week are up to 1.4 million people who filed for unemployment just last week. And that's the first increase in the week-to-week number we've seen since March. And as I said, not surprisingly, given those economic and health indicators, the voters are judging Trump harshly on his handling of the pandemic. Just over 1/3 of respondents in most polls give him positive marks on this, what they consider to be their most important issue. Now, I'm going to share another statistic with you that's not polling related, but I think is just as indicative as to the dynamics of the race as it now stands. There is a entity, a data analytics firm called FactBase. And FactBase tracks the president's comments and tweets on a daily basis. Can you imagine that being your job? Well, in any case, FactBase, over the months of March and April, said that there were 812 times, 812 occurrences in those 2 months when President Trump referenced the coronavirus using some language or the other, 812 times. In May and June, he only mentioned the pandemic 278 times, roughly 1/3 of the amount of times that he had mentioned in the prior 2 months. Now, what's going on here is not a surprise. The president decided that the more he talked about the coronavirus, the more unpleasant voters would find the information. So he tried to change the subject and talked about a number of different issues instead. And as he did that, as he stopped talking about an issue that was of such primary interest and import to the voters, his poll numbers began sinking. Over the course of Trump's political career, he's known, perhaps intuitively, that talking about things that even aren't popular, even that are controversial, can sort of crowd out other voices from the conversation. And so over the years, he's engaged on any number of topics, trying to drown out first his Republican primary opponents in 2016, and then Secretary Clinton in the 2016 general election. Well, when Donald Trump stopped talking about the coronavirus, voters stopped hearing his side of the story. They started hearing other voices. And not surprisingly, voters have, over these last few months, dramatically lessened their impression of how well he's handling the crisis because they haven't heard him talking about it. According to that Washington Post poll I mentioned earlier, Biden now has a 20-point advantage among voters who think that he is better, more capable of handling the pandemic than Donald Trump is. They also think by a 25-point margin that he's preferable, would be better on race relations. And interestingly, they believe that by a 9-point margin, that Biden would be preferable on crime and safety issues. Ever since March, we've talked about Trump's advantage being that his supporters are more motivated than Biden's. And Trump has been trying to motivate those voters even further by talking about law and order and crime-related issues. And so very interesting in this poll is even despite Trump's efforts on these points, voters do seem, albeit by a narrower margin, to prefer Biden on issues relating to crime and safety. Last point I'll mention here, and then we can go on with our third topic, is Trump's focus, as I just mentioned, as we've talked about all spring and summer long, Trump's focus is on motivating his base. Biden, on the other hand, has decided strategically that his top priority should be persuading those voters in the political center into his camp. His campaign has taken the calculated risk that distaste for Trump will motivate the base of the Democratic Party, even if they're not that excited about Biden. And so if you think about it, Biden has resisted calls to abolish private insurance, resisted calls to ban fracking, resisted calls to decriminalize immigration, and to defund the police. And that has cost him some enthusiasm on the left, but it's allowed him to win over large numbers of swing voters. And while Trump's supporters are still more motivated than Biden's, that motivation gap is closing. Although Biden's strongest supporters, the Democratic base, are motivated much more through animus toward Trump than support for Biden. And we can talk later today or in the future, again, about why that's a potential challenge for Biden. Last thing I'll mention on this before we go on to the last topic is I want to go back to those numbers I mentioned earlier about the amount of time that the president has spent talking about the coronavirus. Again, in March or April, he mentioned the virus more than 800 times. In May and June, most recent 2 months, he talked about it roughly with 1/3 the frequency that he had previously. And so when the president decided to restart his briefings earlier this week that he discontinued back in April, there are two things going on there. As we talked about last week, Trump's advisors know he's behind in the polls. So does he. That's why he fired demoted his campaign manager last week. But Trump's advisors, once again, know that seeding the stage on the coronavirus has sidelined the president from the conversation that the American people think is the most important discussion going on in their country today. As I said, Trump has always understood that dominating the voters' attention is key. But by diminishing the topic of most interest to the American people, he was essentially forfeiting the argument. And so when he reemerged to begin the briefings again this week, that's basically Trump and his team saying, I can't win the argument unless I'm in it. Will he win that argument? We don't know. We'll see what happens going forward. But at least for the foreseeable future, those briefings in the eyes of Trump and his staff are the way to re-engage him in a conversation that he's been losing very, very badly. Bottom line in this race, Joe Biden has a big lead. Like I said, 8 points, 10 points, maybe 15 points. We don't know, but it's big and it's growing. But that lead will almost certainly shrink over the course of the next few months. The last candidate to come back from a deficit this size in the summer of an election year and win a general election was George H.W. Bush more than 30 years ago, when he trailed Michael Dukakis by a margin actually slightly larger than the one that Trump currently trails Biden. Two things to remember, though. Michael Dukakis was not nearly as well known in that race by the American voters as Joe Biden is now, which makes defining Dukakis a much easier job for the Bush campaign in that era than for the Trump campaign defining Biden now, because voters already have a strong opinion of him. It's also worth noting that Trump's approval rating is much lower than then Vice President Bush's was in the 1988 campaign. So there is precedent for a presidential candidate to come back from this type of deficit, but it is unusual, and even there the circumstances are somewhat different. Last point, and we'll cover a little bit quickly today, and then maybe we can come back to this topic again in a future. We can talk about it in more depth. So I want to talk a little bit about the polarization of the American electorate in the partisan bubble in which we find ourselves. And so, Claire, I'm going to ask you to put up the next question we have, or question number 3, and see how people respond. So the question, and remember, this is anonymous. We don't know who's answering and what they're saying. So tell us the truth here, people. The question is, how often do you make a proactive effort to read or listen to a commentator with whom you disagree politically? And this webinar does not count. So how often, not just do you happen to hear or happen to read, but how often do you make the effort proactively to expose yourself to commentary or analysis from someone with whom you disagree politically? And let's see what our results show for this question. Okay, on a daily basis, 19%, almost 20% of you. I think that's really admirable. 33% on a weekly basis. That means more than half of you, at least once a week, will actively seek out someone on the other side of a discussion to hear what they have to say. 18% of you do that on a monthly basis. 30%, almost 1/3 of you say that you never seek out someone on the other side. And while I try not to take sides in these kind of poll questions, I would say for the 30% of you who did, to your credit, answer honestly, I would say that I do think democracy functions much more effectively when we're willing to expose ourselves to people with whom we disagree, as difficult as that can often be. So we've got one more question along these lines. It's a little bit more personal. So Claire, let's put that one up and see what people say. This question is, how often do you talk with someone, a friend, a work colleague, a family member, about politics who you believe will vote for another presidential candidate this November? So rather than who do you read, who do you listen to in terms of commentary and analysis, how about personal engagement? How often do you talk with someone about politics who you know, who's on the other side of the aisle? And let's see what kind of responses we get for that one, Claire. Daily, 13% of you talk to somebody with whom you disagree on a daily basis. That's very impressive, particularly in a time of social distancing. 24% say weekly, 27% say monthly. So a little bit more than half of you will, not on a frequent basis, but on a regular basis, engage in conversation with someone with whom you disagree on such an important decision. And 36%, slightly more than a third of you, say that you never do that. And my very educated guess is that that number has gone up considerably over the last 4 years as American politics has become more and more partisan, more and more polarized, more and more balkanized. So I'm just going to make a couple points on this, and then once again, maybe we can come back to this topic and talk about it in more detail in a future program, because it is a really important topic to think about. Because what makes this election so challenging is how few voters are undecided. Donald Trump is the motivator in chief. People are either very, very motivated on his behalf or very, very motivated against him. But as is the case with Donald Trump in so many other areas, to a large degree, the president is a symptom rather than a primary cause of this polarization. And in fact, we've seen this trending toward hyperpartisanship going on for many years, long before Donald Trump ran for president. Way back in the day, when I worked on political campaigns back in the 20th century, we subscribed to what was called the 80-20 theory of politics. And the 80-20 theory of politics, as the title implies, says that a campaign, a smart campaign, spends 80% of its time, 80% of its money, and 80% of its resources on the middle 20% of the voters, because persuading that political center was of such critical importance. But over the years, culminating with Trump, but for the last couple of decades, there's been gradually more and more emphasis on base motivation at the expense of persuading undecided voters. Biden, as I mentioned earlier, has made some effort to talk to the political center because Trump has left them so available to him. But the overall trend of the elections has been much more about intensifying that partisanship and polarization than trying to bridge it. And one of Joe Biden's greatest challenges, if he is elected president in November, as so many of you predicted, is will he be able to reverse that trend? Or have we become so polarized and so suspicious of each other that that's beyond the efforts of a president who wants to do so? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that polarization. Some of it is just self-selected living habits. We're the most mobile society in the history of planet Earth, and we tend to live in communities where we're comfortable. There was a time throughout much of human history in which we chose those communities based on people who looked like us, based on their race, based on their ethnicity, based on their religion. More and more now, that self-selected geographic location trending tends to be done less on whether someone looks like us or not, but whether they think like us or not. And more of us live in ideologically homogenous communities where we're not exposed to people with whom we disagree, which is why I think so many of you guys deserve so much credit for making the effort to seek out information and opinion from people who do not agree with you. The biggest reason for this, though, I think, and this will be a topic for another day, is the way our media habits have changed. From watching an evening newscast or reading a daily paper in the morning, in which most members of a community, from the left and the right, drunk from the same pool of information, to a much more atomized news media, where we can rely on cable television, on talk radio, and on online and digital media for information and opinion that's sculpted to our interests. I tell my students at Cal and at SC and Pepperdine, I tell them about Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill working together to save Social Security. I tell them about Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton working together on trade and welfare issues. I tell them about Nancy Pelosi and George W. Bush teaming up in the 2008 financial crisis. But for these young people, those are just historical artifacts. They have no firsthand reference points for those type of bipartisan efforts. And to a large degree, while our political leaders deserve great condemnation for not making the effort the way it was done in the past, to a large degree, they're simply responding to what their voters are asking, if not demanding of them. This fall, I'm assigning two books I have not assigned before to my classes. One is called Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein, the very respected progressive journalist at Vox. The other is a book called Them, and Them was written by conservative Republican Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska. Both are excellent analyses of these trends, and both are well worth reading, so I'd encourage them both. Lots more to talk about on polarization, lots more to talk about on the election, but maybe it's time, and in fact, I can see that it's a little bit past time for you to tell me what you want to talk about rather than me just assuming. So Jessica, maybe we can go on a little bit belatedly today and get in as many questions as possible from our audience.
Sounds good. Yes, so we've got a lot of questions coming in already. The first, how much control does the state have over federal law enforcement in the state?
Okay. Ultimately, although the federal government is legally restricted to what its representatives can do in terms of law enforcement in a state, ultimately, the president does have the ability under what was called the Insurrection Act, passed all the way back in 1807. The president does have the authority, and I quote, to call forth the militia or the armed forces, unquote, to take measures he considers necessary to suppress in a state any insurrection, domestic violence, or unlawful combination. So on one hand, federal representatives are somewhat restricted in what they can do in a state. Law enforcement is primarily a local and state responsibility. But as you just heard, the Insurrection Act presents a tremendous loophole that Eisenhower and Bush and others have used over the years. And so there are profound legal and constitutional questions about whether the federal law enforcement agents in Portland have overstepped those boundaries or not. And it does seem that there's an effort in Chicago and Albuquerque and Kansas City and other places to have the federal law enforcement presence working in coordination with locals. So the locals are supposed to take precedence, but there's a really big loophole there for a president who wants to take advantage of it. And it appears that at least in Portland, this president has done just that.
A couple of people asked about using troops and federal officers interchangeably or distinguishing between federal agents and the use of the National Guard in previous crises. Is there a difference between law enforcement and military to back up other efforts?
There is a distinction, but ultimately the president has purview over both Guard troops and other federal representatives from the Department of Justice, and most recently from the Department of Homeland Security, which was only created in the aftermath of the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. And so the restrictions are slightly different depending on the branch of federal law enforcement. But ultimately, the president, at least according to the Insurrection Act, does have ultimate authority. In the past, as I mentioned earlier, presidents who have deployed a federal presence over the objection of local or state elected officials have done so in quiet coordination with those local and state leaders That does not appear to be the case in Portland. It does appear to be the case in Chicago and potentially elsewhere.
Thank you. Do you believe that Trump's insinuation of federal law enforcement in Portland and other cities will enhance his re-election chances?
Very good question. And the very best answer I can give is he does. Donald Trump and his advisors clearly do believe that law enforcement and public safety issues are the way to win back those older voters, are to win back those working class women that I was talking about earlier. And the fact that he's devoting so much of his campaign's advertising budget to advertising on this issue suggests to me that he also sees a demonstrable political benefit in a federal law enforcement presence in these cities. And Trump himself, never one to hold his cards too close to the vest, has on many, many occasions over the last several days made a point of talking about Democratic cities with Democratic mayors that have not been able, in his opinion, to keep their public safe. And so by continually introducing a partisan aspect to a federal law enforcement presence, it becomes even more clear, along with his advertising strategy, that the president believes that it will be successful. Do I think it will be? It could be, but I think one of the greatest challenges that the president faces is, unlike when presidents or presidential candidates of both parties have relied on law and order messages in the past, whether Richard Nixon in 1968 or Bill Clinton in 1992 or any number of others, they did so with an electorate, particularly a suburban electorate, that was much more naturally inclined to support stronger law enforcement efforts. And the demographics of this country and of this country's suburbs have changed a great deal over the last generation. And public opinion polling shows that even those Americans who are not supportive of the protests, they are supportive of more measured law enforcement engagement and more restrained changes in the area of police reform. So it's not clear that this president has as receptive an audience to a very confrontational law and order message as his predecessors do. But given where he sits in the polls, I think Trump, at least tactically, understands that this issue may be his best one to come back, barring a miraculous cure of the pandemic.
Thank you. I'm going to ask two questions here. They're from different questioners, but they kind of complement what you just said. Are cities run by Democratic mayors the only ones experiencing significant rises in violent crimes? And the other questioner is Trump encouraging his base to foment trouble in cities that are run by Democrats? So two very different perspectives on this issue of the violence in these cities.
Well, as we've talked about in this webinar many times in the past, there's a tremendous urban-rural divide in American politics. Over the years, and especially under the Trump presidency, small town and rural America has become increasingly conservative and increasingly Republican, and large city urban America has become more and more Democrat. There are some cities with Republican mayors. The city of San Diego, just down Interstate 5 from us, has a Republican mayor, Kevin Faulconer. Among the top 20 cities of population in this country, I believe, and I would have to check, I believe that 4 or 5 have Republican mayors, including the mayor of Jacksonville, Florida, which is, I think, one of the reasons that the Republicans moved their convention there earlier this year. But because urban America is so heavily Democratic, it's difficult to put together a reliable comparison between the two. But crime is up significantly in Chicago. It's been up significantly in Baltimore and some of the other cities that Trump is talking about. Sociologists and criminologists much smarter than me can argue back and forth as to the causes for those increases in crime. But regardless of whether or not those crime increases are caused by a city electing a Democratic mayor, Trump clearly sees a political opportunity, and I think that Trump clearly sees a political opportunity to pin this on the opposition party. And as far as the president encouraging his supporters to agitate in these protests and demonstrations, unlike what we saw at some of his rallies back in the 2016 campaign, and since, I'm not aware, and I could be wrong, I'm not aware of evidence that the president's team is actively trying to instigate the kind of confrontation the questioner asks about, but I don't know that. I'm not aware of it, but I don't know that for a fact.
Thank you. Both Eisenhower and Bush deployed National Guard troops to Arkansas and Los Angeles, respectively, which was legally authorized. The present deployments are not of the National Guard, but of various federal agencies that are not authorized to conduct local domestic policing activities. Isn't this a serious distinction?
It is an important distinction. That said, what's less clear is whether the president still has that authority with other federal law enforcement agents as opposed to the National Guard. For example, the Department of Homeland Security officers who are in Portland are there ostensibly to protect federal buildings, some of which have been vandalized, graffiti, broken windows, that sort of thing, over the course of the last several weeks of protests in that city. And then the conversation becomes that if you're protecting a building, do you need to remain in or immediately adjacent to that building? Or can you go out further into the community in order to try to apprehend or identify a potential suspect? These are the types of things on which lawsuits are filed in both directions, in which federal judges decide, like the federal judges hearing the entreaty from Oregon's Attorney General. But once again, and I'm not a lawyer, and I admit to that freely and occasionally proudly, is legal minds who I respect look back at the Insurrection Act as a piece of law that is not particularly well defined. And there is significant disagreement within the legal community over how much flexibility that provides for a president. So the questioner's concern is a legitimate one. These are federal agents who occupy a different role in the system than National Guard members, but there is fierce disagreement on how much of a leeway the act provides for a president. So we don't know.
Thank you. And this might be sort of a follow-up question to that same legal concern, but can you discuss the limits of what's legally permitted in terms of federal troops addressing general violent crime, like high homicide rate in Chicago, versus simply protecting federal facilities or enforcing a federal law akin to civil rights enforcement at schools?
So Chicago's a fascinating situation, because the mayor of that city, Lori Lightfoot, made it very clear that she did not want federal law enforcement in the city. That said, the head of the Police Protective League did request the Trump administration that federal support be given. And what appears to have happened there, and Mayor Lightfoot has agreed to this, not enthusiastically, but recognizing the circumstances, has agreed, as I mentioned earlier, to a coordinated approach in which federal law enforcement officers will act in support of police and other local or state law enforcement presence and will coordinate with them. It's not clear to me, I should admit, on whether those federal agents report to local or state law enforcement, but it's very clear that there's been a very specifically delineated set of duties that federal law enforcement can engage in. And Lightfoot has made it clear that if the federal law enforcement presence goes beyond those very specific areas of responsibility, then at that point, she will stand up and she'll push back.
Thank you. When protesters are arrested, are authorities allowed to use their cell phone contacts to find the names of other protesters?
I don't know the answer to that. I've read quite a bit about the need for warrants to search an accused cellular and computer data. I just don't know enough about the law, and I'm sure that we have people in the audience who do, who hopefully can send in some guidance for you and for me on this. But I'm just not familiar enough with the warrant requirements for a law enforcement officer accessing that information. I'm happy to check on it for next week, but if I know our audience as well as I think I do, I suspect most of them will have checked on it on their own by then.
Sounds good. Just out of curiosity, are there any polls from people in Chicago or Portland about the response by their local government versus what they're seeing with the federal enforcement?
I haven't seen anything yet, and I think it's virtually certain that we will in the days ahead. What I will tell you, just from having done some polling in the past, is that polling on a local basis is very difficult. National polls, even statewide polls, allowed you to get the kind of sample that allows you to get reliable data. Polls done in a particular municipality, while they can be done, are more difficult. A city like Chicago, which is one of the largest in the country, like Los Angeles, does tend to see more of this. Polling in Portland, while it can be done, is going to be a little bit tricky.
Yeah.
I suspect we'll see it in the future. One interesting thing as it relates, though, to public opinion in Portland is, as many of you may have read, last night the mayor of Portland, Mayor Wheeler, decided to participate in the protests himself. And in fact, he was tear gassed himself. But when Wheeler went out and tried to give an address the protesters, he was jeered by many of them because they felt that he had not been sufficiently supportive of them and had been overly supportive of local law enforcement in their efforts to contain the protest. So I have no doubt that the people of Portland, Oregon are overwhelmingly opposed to the Trump administration presence in their city. No mystery there. But it gets a little bit more complicated when you get down to, on one hand, protesters thinking the mayor has been too aggressive, and local business and many community leaders who did not think he was aggressive enough in the run-up to the federal deployment. So we'll keep an eye out for polls in future weeks, but I have not seen anything to date.
Yeah, I saw them projecting their demands on the wall behind him, which was they wanted him to do something, but they also wanted him to step down. So I don't know which will come first. But all right.
What else do we have, Jessica?
All right. If Biden wins the election and the Senate still has a Republican majority, how will he get bipartisan support to advance his agenda, or will he have to govern by executive order?
Oh, I think Biden, is simply temperamentally less likely to govern by executive order than either Trump or Obama. Just as someone who served on Capitol Hill for so many years, I just think he's less likely to rely as heavily on executive orders as his predecessors of both parties. Now, the question, it seems to me, is if the Democrats do not achieve a majority, then there is a challenge. There's a tremendous challenge for him as president. But even if Democrats do get a majority, remember it takes 60 votes to end a filibuster in the Senate. And while Democrats appear to be poised towards significant gains in the Senate, I don't think there's any reasonable prediction that sees them getting anywhere close to 60. Biden gave an interview last week, though, that's worth thinking about on this front, whether his party has a narrow majority or a narrow minority in the Senate. So Biden has talked a lot over the course of his campaign and his life about bipartisan cooperation. And a lot of very ardent Democrats, including members of the base of his party who are not that enthusiastic about him, dismiss him as being very naive and says there may have been a time in the past when that kind of bipartisan outreach could work, Mr. Biden, but we're past that time now. Biden did an interview with the Vox online publication last week in which he talked in a little bit more detail about how he defined bipartisanship. And what was interesting to me is he made it clear he wasn't just talking about magical widespread accord in which the two parties magically came together. What he said, rather, is he said Republicans are a coalition and different members have different interests and different priorities. And so he believes, as president, it seems to me, that even if the Senate is closely contested, that rather than assuming that all Republicans and all Democrats will come together in some massive group hug. He believes that there are individual members, not necessarily the most moderate or the more centrist ones, but different members with different issue priorities and issue concerns who can be brought over under certain circumstances. And for someone who has spent as many years in the Senate as Biden has, while there's no guarantee that that type of effort will be successful, the fact that he looks at bipartisanship not as a broad-based effort, but rather as an individual, person by person, member by member exercise, I actually found somewhat encouraging.
Do you believe that Trump's belated and tepid endorsement of mask wearing will upset his base and or enhance his re-election chances, or will they see him as being a flip-flopper?
I would say that at this point, the president's occasional efforts toward encouraging masks is not going to have much of an impact on the campaign one way or the other. It's pretty clear from polling, even before Trump wore his mask in public for the first time a week or so ago, it's pretty clear that even large majorities of Republicans felt that wearing a mask was the right and responsible thing to do. There's a relatively small number of members of his base who don't think that's the right thing to do. And I can't imagine them moving off of him at this point, given the very strong likelihood that they agree with him so fervently on so many other issues. The fact that he has somewhat tentatively embraced mask wearing more recently, not constantly, not everywhere, not for everyone, but under certain circumstances, I can't imagine that that's going to change the mind of anyone who is who felt poorly about the way, who disagreed with the way he's handled the issue in the past. Opinions on Trump are pretty well baked in at this point. And I think opinions on Trump and masks are even more solid and are probably not going to change many votes going forward in his favor or against.
Thank you. While Trump's poor response to the coronavirus has led to a resurgence of the virus, do you think, as Americans continue to be isolated and become restless, that potentially Trump could regain some level of support from voters who see him as the key to reopening their community?
Well, right now, voters so strongly disapprove of his handling of the pandemic that I think the only thing that's going to change that is notable progress towards society reopening, either through the introduction of a vaccine, which does not appear that it's going to happen before November, or through the virus subsiding through other more natural means. I don't know that there's anything that the president can say at this point about the coronavirus that will help or hurt his reelection chances. At this point, if the issue is going to begin to work more in his favor, it's going to be because of changes in facts on the ground, as opposed to changes in the nature of the political discussion about it.
Thank you. This is you putting on your polling expertise hat. Given the Electoral College tilt against Democrats, the margin of error of national popular polls, and possible Bradley effects, how much of a lead would you need to see in the polls before you can say with confidence that the polls say Biden will win?
I will never, ever, ever make a prediction on a presidential election with confidence ever again, regardless of the margin in the polls. Some of you may remember the famous Mark Twain story about the cat who sat on a hot stove. Well, as you remember, a cat who sits on a hot stove will never sit on a hot stove again, ever, but he'll never sit on a cold stove again either. So Jessica, if you and I had been having this conversation 4 years ago, I would have said every reliable polling metric shows Secretary Clinton is going to win. I think it's likely more than likely to happen. Look at the 2020 campaign as my version of a cold stove. I won't go there. What I will say, taking my own predictive limitations out of it, is a couple things to think about when it comes to margins. Number one, most of the polls we're seeing now are polls of all registered voters. And as the election draws closer, more and more polls will begin instead asking people whether they're likely to vote. And because Republicans, for all sorts of demographic and cultural reasons, are more likely regular voters than Democrats, generally speaking, in most elections, when polls shift from a regular voter frame to a likely voter frame, the margin does narrow to some degree. In the Washington Post poll that I referenced earlier, for example, Biden has a 15-point lead among all voters, but when those voters were asked if they were certain to vote, that lead shrunk to 10 or 11 points. Now, again, as we've talked about many times, we don't really know what the absolute numbers are. We trace the trajectory and the trending instead. So we do know that Biden has been steadily increasing his lead. But for those who are watching the popular vote instead of the electoral vote, which might not be the best idea anyway, as we've learned in the past, there will be some closure when the polls begin asking likely voters. If it's a 15-point margin, that closure won't matter all that much. If it's a 3 or 4 point margin, it becomes a much bigger deal.
Thank you. A lot of people are asking about Trump possibly claiming that there was mail-in voter fraud to deny the election outcome. What is your thought on that? Do you think that he'll do that if that is the case, if he does lose, and will he be resistant to leave the White House?
There's a phenomenal story in this morning's Washington Post that I would recommend about how the president would respond to an election defeat and whether or how he would leave. And both Biden and Speaker Pelosi have made some fairly dismissive comments saying, either way, we're swearing in a new president at noon on January 20th. The location of where that president is not nearly as important. And one of Biden's spokespersons has made an allusion to perhaps military removal of President Trump from the White House. I wouldn't know how to predict. I've learned over 5 years not to predict Donald Trump. But there is concern among Democrats and some Republicans that if he is defeated, he may challenge the results, either because it's a very close election, but more likely because given the large numbers of people who are voting for mail in this election, it's entirely possible we might not know the results on Tuesday, November 3rd. And if it takes days or even weeks for some closely contested swing states to count their mail ballots, as we've seen in major primary states, then that's where the back and forth argument can become a particularly difficult one. Trump himself has made it very clear that he does not approve of mail voting, although he says that voting by absentee, which he does, is acceptable. And he says that much to the consternation, interestingly enough, of many Republican Party officials and many Republican Party electeds, because they know that their party needs their voters to vote by mail this fall. But it is pretty clear that Trump is using the prospect of voter fraud through mail voting as a way of potentially setting up an argument against the election outcome, should he be unsuccessful in November. I didn't begin to predict whether or how or under what circumstances he would leave on January 20th or before or after, but it seem pretty obvious that, and he was asked very directly by Chris Wallace last Sunday whether he would respect the results of the election, and Trump talked right away about the potential for voter fraud in terms of mail voting. So to me, he is clearly setting that up as a possible point of argument should it become necessary come November or December.
Thank you. I know we're kind of getting close to the end of the hour, but I wanted to ask some of the questions that people asked about the polarization. Are you good to go a little bit longer?
Absolutely. And then again, I think this is a subject worth revisiting, particularly as it relates to the media's role in our polarization and partisanship.
That's the first question.
Okay.
All right. So the first question, do you think that the media exaggerates the degree of polarization by focusing on the most polarizing topics? Do you believe there are many topics on which many people can basically agree?
Boy, I think it's a terrific question. There was once a saying when it came to local news media in their coverage of crime issues, the saying in the newsroom was, if it bleeds, it leads. And while we're not quite as dramatic when it comes to politics, I think most news organizations, intuitively or intentionally, know that if something's controversial, it leads. So yes, those topics on which there are arguments and controversy and dispute do get a disproportionate amount of attention. And so I think to some degree, just like media coverage of almost any topic tends to exaggerate its importance, this is called the greenhouse effect of news media. I think in particular, it does intensify the feelings of polarization. That said, most public opinion polling over several decades shows that media exaggeration or not, we are much more divided. We are much more polarized. We are much more balkanized than we were in years past. So even without that media lens, the way we tend to regard each other, what we think about people who vote for other candidates or belong to different political parties, those feelings have become much more intense and much more hostile and much more angry over the years. And so I'll go back to the questions that we asked our audience earlier. Those of you who make the time and effort to even occasionally talk to people with whom you disagree, I think it's an excellent way of minimizing the sort of automatic polarization, because you do get reminded that even someone who makes different political choices, more likely than not, isn't doing so because they're evil or stupid, but because they're a reasonably concerned citizen who just has a different idea on how to solve a community's problems than we do.
Thank you. Can you talk about the use of propaganda and give resources to help learn about this?
Boy, much longer conversation, which Jessica, we probably ought to set up as a standalone topic. There's been no shortage that's been written and broadcast and analyzed about the role that Russian government representatives played in fomenting public discord during the 2016 campaign. And there's even more evidence that not just Russia, but other countries are looking to do the same in 2020 as well. What's less noticed is how many domestic actors, US citizens or at least residents of the United States, engage in the same type of behavior, particularly when it comes to online communication. Forwarding, retweeting, liking information that's of dubious value at best, passing it on because it reinforces a worldview that we already hold. The international threat is a considerable one, and I note that Vice President Biden did talk about that earlier this week. But any online actor, whether from another country or this one, has a much better, more formidable platform from which to disseminate that misinformation much more quickly than ever before in human history. What I will tell you, just for a little bit of encouragement, is the Pew Research people did a study on this, on misinformation and so-called fake news a few years ago. And what they found is that young people, millennials and Generation Z, are much better at separating out real news from fake news than us older people are. So Jessica, pass on my admiration to your friends. You and Claire and Christina and the rest of your generation are much better at deciphering and differentiating between what's real and what's fake. Us old people, we're still learning how to do it.
Fair enough. Can polarization be addressed through abolishing a two-party winner-takes-all system?
Really, really interesting question. Does polarization go away if you have 3 or 4 or multiple parties? And I don't think it does. What we see in countries with parliamentary systems, what we see in Israel, what we see in Italy, what we see in Great Britain and elsewhere, is that the polarization and the distrust and the mutual hostility is just as intense. It's just not quite as easy to categorize statistically, because rather than there being 2 camps, there's 3 or 4 or 5 or more. But the dynamic that sort of the human nature instinct that when we're feeling frightened, when we're feeling angry, when we're feeling threatened, we look for someone else to blame. That's something that's innate in us. And it doesn't disappear when there's 2 other parties or 5 other parties, as opposed to just one.
Thank you. This person is asking, and maybe we'll broaden it a little bit, but who would you suggest to listen to for commentators who are fair and balanced Republican or conservative journalists? And maybe you have some suggestions for both sides.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned this to this group in the past, but on the last day of every semester, I tell my students at all three of the schools where I teach, I tell them, I say, guys, I'm going to give you one last assignment. And this is not an assignment I can grade because we're at the end of the semester, but it's the most important assignment I'm going to give you. And I said, here's the assignment. I want every principled conservative in this room to watch Rachel Maddow once a week. And I want every principled progressive in this room to read George Will or Bret Stephens or Ross Douthat once a week. There's plenty of other conservatives, plenty of other progressive commentators, of course, on the landscape. Those are the ones who I generally try to encourage, people who are, to their credit, looking to expose themselves to opposing voices. And because I think the instinct, and it's a really admirable one, is not to expose yourself to those voices to change your mind, but just to open it. And because it's really, really easy in such a bifurcated, polarized environment to turn to point to the angriest, loudest, weirdest voices on the other side. Say, I can't work with people over there. Look at that freak. Look at that idiot. But there are smart people over on the other side. And the Maddows and the Krugmans on one side, the Wills and the Stephens and the Douthats on the other, you might not have to agree with them, but at the very least, you should be able to respect their intellectual underpinnings, even if they happen to come to different conclusions than you do.
Thank you. And this will be our final question. I just think it's a fun one. Do you have any idea about Kanye West and what he is doing by declaring himself a presidential candidate?
Well, I will defer to his wife, Ms. Kardashian, who's made it clear that she and her family are concerned about him, not politically, but psychologically. And while there are all sorts of tempting one-liners to throw at a Kanye West for president campaign, if Kim Kardashian is right, and this is genuinely a troubled and unbalanced individual, then I think I'll offer sympathy rather than ridicule.
I think that's a good call. Thank you so much, Kim. I'm going to turn the conversation over to you.
And thank you for such an informative conversation again, and thank you for taking it longer. I know all of our viewers enjoy questions with you. So for our viewers, if you did enjoy this program, here's how you can pledge your support. Simply text Schnur, S-C-H-N-U-R, to the number that will be appearing on the screen shortly. This is in honor of our wonderful, respected politics professor. Text S-C-H-N-U-R to this number and show how you can support us to keep this quality programming ongoing. In addition to that, if you like these conversations with Dan, we've started special member-only conversations with Dan that are very interactive, where you can ask questions to Dan directly. So go to our website at lawac.org if you're not a member, and sign up to become a member, and you'll get exclusive invitations to conversations with Dan. Go to the website too to register for upcoming events. We've got U.S. Senator Tim Scott coming up next week, a business ethics, new rules of engagement discussion with a head of Airbnb, and we've got a panel with LMU University leadership on the challenges and opportunities for higher education. And of course, every Thursday, 11 a.m., politics in the time of coronavirus with our own Dan Schnur. So please stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you soon. Thank you, Dan, again, so much.